Hey friends, my name's Steven with Leviathan Snakes, and for this week I want to talk about why I think, or we think here at Leviathan Snakes, that tubs, things like this, whether they are from professional racking systems or even just tubs that you would buy from, let's say, Walmart, provide the best enclosure for ball pythons. And I know what I said. I know I said best, and this video isn't talking about like all the controversies between the different types of enclosures, but simply the reasons why we think, personally, in our opinions, that tubs provide the best care for ball pythons. So let's get to it. One thing that I think is really important to state up front is that you can have amazing care for a ball python in any type of enclosure that's relatively within reason and like standard. So this would be like a glass terrarium, 4 foot by 2 foot PVC enclosure, a tub system, whether it's a professional racking system like an ARS, or it could just be like a DIY rack system, or even just a tub that you get from Walmart that's appropriately sized. All of them can take amazing care of ball pythons. And I think that this is really, really important to state up front because oftentimes on the internet, people state their opinion and act as if their opinion is a fact, that their opinion, like us saying that we believe that tubs take the best care of ball pythons, that is a fact. And that's not true. It is just our opinion, and the same is true for people who say that they think a 4 foot by 2 foot PVC enclosure takes the best care of their ball pythons. They're both opinions. And the one thing that I want to state for this video up front is that all of them can be right. So there's different things that people consider when they are choosing the type of enclosure for their animal. And the reason why we think that ball pythons, specifically ball pythons, because each species is different and requires different needs, but ball pythons do so well in tubs is because they are perfectly suited for the ball python. We're going to talk about that here now. And one reason why I think that tubs are really, really good for ball pythons is because of the hot spot. So a hot spot for a ball python should be about 90 degrees, maybe a little bit lower, maybe a little bit higher, but generally about 90 degrees. It doesn't have to be exact, but the reason why this is important for a ball python is that the hot spot, the belly heat from the hot spot, helps them digest food. So if you fed let's say Vinny here, if you fed him a pretty big sized prey item and it was like big enough for him to eat, but he was in an area that was way too cold. Let's say that he was in a bioactive enclosure that had a really, really thick layer of substrate underneath it. So essentially there's no heat that could come up through a belly heat. And in this situation, he's just put into a living room where maybe the house is about 70 degrees or so. Now, maybe it is wintertime, and while the house is normally about 70 degrees, to save money while they're at work or something like that, his owners in this situation could maybe drop the heat down. And if it's in the 60s and he doesn't really have a hot spot and his ambient in the enclosure isn't set up correctly, it can lead to problems digesting his food, which could lead to regurgitations, it can lead to partial digestion, and it can actually lead to death and actual serious health injuries because he might sit in his belly long enough without digesting because it was such a big meal, causing it to rot. And it is this reason why hot spots are really, really important for ball pythons, because the hot spot is what's going to make sure that he is always going to have a good digestion. So the reason why tubs are awesome for hot spots is because they're made of plastic. Most of the time they're made of plastic. I don't know any situation where they're not made of plastic. And that plastic doesn't retain heat super well, which is actually a good thing, because when we very, very first started having ball pythons, we kept them in glass terrariums, and we had a heat mat on this glass terrarium. Our albino girl was in there. Awesome. It was a great setup. But the heat mat, even though it was hooked up to a thermostat, was heating up the glass itself too hot. So when Delilah would kind of push away the substrate to get closer to the heating element, the glass itself, as it would turn on for the heating element, get up to 90 and then turn off, the glass was staying hotter than what the heating element was. And when this happened, each time the heating element kicked back on, it heated up the glass a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more, and it actually led to belly burns for her. So that's actually why we stopped using glass terrariums, because there was a risk of burning the ball python even though they were on a thermostat and it was on an appropriate heat mat. So you don't have to worry about that with plastic tubs, the thing that you might have to worry about on plastic tubs is if a heating element malfunctions, that the plastic could melt. But one reason why that is actually a little bit better, in my opinion, is that you can smell it. So you're not going to smell glass getting too hot, but you can smell if there is a problem with the heating element because it got way too hot and it's starting to melt your tub. And you can immediately find the problem and deal with it before an animal gets hurt. So that's one reason why we think that plastic is actually better than glass. And PVC also is better than glass in our opinion for this example. Now, going off of a hotspot heat element, we want to talk about the ambient heat element. And this is actually probably one of the reasons why I think that tubs shine when they're compared to large PVC enclosures or large glass enclosures. And that is, with a large enclosure, you have more volume of air that's in it, which means that there's more air that needs to be heated to the appropriate temperature. So for an ambient temperature, ball pythons need to be about 80-ish degrees ambient. So this allows them to have, there's a bee in here. Oh no. But anyways, so if you have an ambient degrees or ambient temperature of about 80 degrees Fahrenheit, this is going to be perfect for the ball python. It's going to give them a good thermal gradient from the hot spot to the cool end. They're going to be awesome. Now, it also helps out with humidity, but I'll get to that in a second. So for tubs, these tubs are generally fully enclosed, so that way there's some like holes on the top for like airflow, and there's a little bit of space like right about here that allows like air to pass through. But because they are fully enclosed, it adds better insulation so that way it can hold in the heat from the hot spot and keep the entire tub at a consistent controlled climate. You can also set up like an ambient climate in here, so like we are actually, like it's about 80 degrees in here ambient, which is a little hot for people, but perfect for ball pythons. Now, the problem with the big enclosures is that there is so much air, and oftentimes they have like screen tops and there's too much airflow, that the air in the enclosure, the ambient air in the enclosure, without having an extra heating source besides the heat mat, ends up being the same temperature as the rest of the room. And because most people keep ball pythons in their home, where you're not keeping the temperature in ambient of 80, it's probably going to be closer to 70 or whatever you keep your house at. And this ambient temperature of being too low, it can create situations where the ball pythons don't have a proper thermal gradient, so they always stay on the hot spot. And again, this staying on the hot spot, especially if it's with a glass enclosure, can lead to belly burns. So if you don't want to risk it, again, this is one reason why that tub enclosures are really, really good for ball pythons, because they have really, really good control over the climate internally within their enclosure. Going off of temperature, going on to humidity, I kind of talked about it a little bit earlier. So ball pythons minimum need about 60% humidity. And this is actually quite a bit. It's not crazy high, but again, this is the minimum. If it drops below 60, you need to make sure they get more humidity. They do awesome in 70% humidity and up to 80% humidity. With ball pythons, if you are keeping them in your house and not in a specific room or specific like building that's set up and controlled humidity within the room, the humidity of the enclosure is going to pretty much always end up matching what the humidity of the room is, and most houses are about 40% humidity, and this changes depending on your area. Our house is about 40% humidity, just naturally. Now, in the winter, it actually gets way more dry, and in the summer, it might get a little bit more humid. It just kind of depends on exactly what your climate is. The reason why ball pythons need good humidity is it helps them shed. And if they have problems shedding, if the humidity is too low for too long, it will actually dehydrate them. And when this happens, they will get stuck shed, and if you don't take care of stuck shed, it can get multiple layers and it can constrict growth, and it can actually kill your ball python if you let this go on way too long. The reason why tubs are awesome for controlling humidity is because, again, they're almost completely enclosed. They have a little bit of airflow specifically designed for them. And with glass terrariums or with PVC enclosures, often that they have a screened top, which lets out too much humidity. So when you are building out your enclosure for a glass terrarium, it's often advised to cover it with like pieces of plastic, so that way there's not as much loss of humidity for it. But even with the reduction, the mitigation and the loss of humidity, the volume of air inside it is still larger, which means that you have to have more water. You have to have more water in the air, which requires more spraying, more water in the substrate, all of this stuff, in order to up the overall humidity inside the enclosure to appropriate levels. But with this, because there's a less volume of air, because they're not quite as tall, I'm trying to find a spot where you can see them. Right here. Okay, so less volume of air, it's easier to maintain the humidity because you don't need as much water in the enclosure in order to maintain the proper levels. Now, if you have too much water in the enclosure, especially too much water in the substrate, this can lead to scale rot. So if you are in a glass terrarium and you are having trouble with humidity, so you put a bunch of water in the substrate trying to get the humidity up, you might bring the humidity to proper levels, but if the ball python is sitting in moist substrate all day long, it can actually lead to scale rot, which is another potential health problem. So all of these things, whether it is the hotspot, it's the ambient temperature, whether it's the humidity, all of these things are ideally suited in a tub system. But when it comes to a large PVC enclosure or a large glass enclosure, there's a lot more work that's required. So it is specifically this work that is required, which makes me believe that tub systems are easier to care for a ball python. And because they are easier to care for a ball python, it means that the ball python consistently is going to get better care. There's one other thing, which doesn't deal with specific husbandry, but glass terrariums and large PVC enclosures are often way more bulky and heavier and harder to manage, especially with one person. So because of this, it means that it's way harder to give them deep cleans. And if you are not giving your enclosures deep cleans very often when the ball python is defecating or anything like this, it is going to promote the growth of bacteria and fungus throughout the enclosure, and that these things can lead to other health problems like respiratory infections. Tubs are often really, really lightweight in that they are manageable size for one person, even though that they are large. Like these ARS 7030s, they are actually larger than a 20-gallon enclosure, or 20-gallon aquarium. They have a bigger floor space than it. If you were to pull out a 7030 tub and set it down, you can put a 20-gallon aquarium inside of it. It's pretty cool, but people don't realize it because they are designed to look like that they take up the least amount of space possible, but they go really, really deep back. Like these are actually pretty far away from the wall. Now, the reason why deep cleaning enclosures is so important is that you can reduce or mitigate the risk for respiratory infections. So between the husbandry care and the cleaning benefits, tubs are ideally suited to provide all of the things that a ball python needs to make sure that they are healthy and safe. There's one thing that I want to talk about that doesn't have to deal with specific health reasons of ball pythons, and it's usually this aspect is why people tend to lean towards big glass enclosures or big PVC enclosures over tubs, and it has to deal with enrichment. So enrichment, just in case anybody is new to the channel and doesn't really know about it, enrichment is the idea that ball pythons need to do various different types of activities to not be bored, be happy kind of thing. And I do think that ball pythons benefit. There's no harm for them climbing on some branches or anything like that. But I think that often what happens is that people who tout enrichment as the main reason to put them in a large 4-foot by 2-foot enclosure over a tub are anthropomorphizing their snake. They assume that if they were a ball python, would want to be in a large enclosure with lots of space to roam around and lots of places to climb and hide and explore and stuff like that. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with this. I think that it's perfectly fine. It's a valid way to go about it. But the problem, in my opinion, is when somebody is valuing the potential benefit of enrichment over the health and safety of their animal. And if they want to make sure that their ball python has room to climb, but they have a lot of trouble maintaining the humidity because maybe they live in Arizona and their house just dries out the enclosure way too much, even though that there might be a potential benefit of enrichment, overall, in our opinion, it's better to prioritize the health of your animal over the perceived idea that they might like it better. And that's the thing, is that we don't actually know if ball pythons like it better. In fact, that there is quite a bit of evidence that ball pythons' feeding response increases when they are in enclosures like this versus large enclosures. And this is due to ball pythons are actually closer to prey items in the wild than they are to predators. And because they're closer to prey items, they want to stay hidden. If they were out and about, just trying to hunt in a big, wide open space, a hawk might see the ball python swoop down and try to eat it for a meal, or some other predator. So because of this, they have evolved to want to be in tight, enclosed spaces so that way they can feel secure. And if they feel secure, then they are willing to eat, because ball pythons, when they eat, are the most vulnerable. They wrap around their prey, they can't really move very well, especially if the prey is like halfway down their mouth. And because of this, if a predator were to find them at that point in time, they'd pretty much be done. So because of this reason, it is often that ball pythons absolutely love being in enclosures like this. And love, I'm putting air quotes. We don't necessarily attribute emotion to them, but they feel way more secure being in enclosures like this versus being in large open enclosures like a 4-foot by 2-foot PVC enclosure or a large glass terrarium. And you can see that with how willing they are to eat. And because they're so willing to eat, that means that they feel absolutely secure in their environment. Now, you can make a ball python feel secure in a large enclosure, but this often requires lots of different hides and lots of different litter. And one of the most common pieces of advice you'll see on places like Our Ball Pythons on Reddit is somebody who says that they are in this big enclosure, just like everybody recommends on those subreddits, but their ball python isn't eating, and that they'll be like, you need to add in more litter, you need to add in more hides. And the thing on this is, while it's true, you 100% need to do that if you're keeping a ball python in an enclosure like this, what they're doing, what those hides and what that litter is doing, is it's tricking the ball python into thinking it's in a smaller space than what it actually is. Thus, it will feel more comfortable to eat because it doesn't feel as exposed to potential predators. So, because you don't have to worry about that with appropriately sized tubs, is another reason why I think that tubs are actually the best enclosure specifically for ball pythons. There's lots of different ways that you can set up tubs. You can set them up fairly bare bones, and this happens a lot, and it's proven to be amazing for breeding ball pythons. People might have like a white liner or paper towels or anything like that on the substrate rather than having like Reptichip or anything like that, because what this does is it makes sure that any time that the ball python uses the bathroom or just defecates or anything like that, that it's immediately being cleaned, so that way that the ball python is in an absolutely pristine condition, or the enclosure is in a pristine condition all the time. Other people want to put Reptichip in there because it helps out with keeping the humidity the right levels, and then they spot clean. And there's lots of different ways. There's not necessarily a wrong way to do it, there's just different approaches. So I think, again, that's the thing on here. You can make an amazing enclosure that is a glass aquarium or glass terrarium for a ball python that takes perfect care of your ball python. You can do the same thing with a 4-foot by 2-foot by 2-foot PVC enclosure. Again, can take amazing care of your ball python. And you can do the same thing in a tub system, whether it's a rack or an individual tub. Often, when you are comparing all of them together, the tub system is going to cost the least amount of money. It is actually going to be the easiest to maintain the proper conditions, and it is going to most likely make sure that your ball python feels the most secure of all of the different enclosures. I hope you guys liked the video. If you did, please like, comment, subscribe, and we will see you next time.